Hello, and welcome to this virtual program, Caught in the Crossfire, Sudanese Women's Struggle for Peace. I'm Elaine Verveer, and I direct the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. Today, Sudan is engulfed in a raging war that has torn the country apart. Mass atrocities are being committed, with warnings that genocide is happening again in Darfur. Nearly 4 million people have been forced to flee their homes. There's untold death, destruction, starvation. But let's go back to just 4 years ago. In 2019, the world looked at Sudan with a great sense of possibility for peace and democratic change. After 30 years in power, the oppressive dictator who had unleashed widespread horrific rights abuses, Omar al-Bashir, was overthrown, wanted by the International Criminal Court on charges of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The victory against Bashir would not have been possible without courageous opposition, civil society activists, especially women, who constituted 70% of the protesters. Their leadership and actions were justifiably referred to as the Women's Revolution. The Transition Military Council that took control of the government after the ouster of Bashir finally agreed to a civilian and military shared power arrangement with the Forces of Freedom and Change, but only after further resistance had come from the protesters who had to demand civilian rule and a transition to democracy. The Sovereign Council, this shared power arrangement, was to rule Sudan for just over 3 years until elections would be held. Instead, in 2021, a coup was launched against the Sovereign Council. The struggle continued over many, many months between pro-democracy forces and the military, with crackdowns and further violence. Negotiations were attempted over and over, but in the end failed to achieve the desired civilian governance. At the heart of the resurgence of violence this April are the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, they a powerful paramilitary group, and the two warring generals who lead them, both vying for power, battling one another for control. The conflict deepens. Today, the war continues, and the people of Sudan are trapped in a dire situation. The promise of shared power, and with it, women's full participation in the political process, has never been fully achieved. And the vision set out by Sudan's women-led pro-democracy movement has yet to be realized. But you will hear shortly, despite the horrors, the Sudanese women remain committed to making their voices heard and once again calling for peace and a better future for Sudan. Today, we will hear from people with firsthand experience of the events in Sudan. We will learn about the severe impacts of the conflict, the humanitarian challenges, and get their recommendations on the ways forward. Before we start, a very brief procedural note. We've already received many pre-submitted questions from our audience members. You will also have the opportunity to submit questions throughout the event by using the chat function on your computer. To begin, we will hear from Safa Adam, who is the President of Community Development for Sudan, an NGO working to build peace in Darfur. She was the head of the gender expert technical team advising the negotiating parties at the Darfur peace negotiations in 2006, and she's been involved in relief operations. She has sent us this message from Darfur, which is in a dire situation and where genocide is once again unfolding. Because of very limited internet connectivity, she is unable to join us live. But let's listen to her now.
Greeting from Sudan. I'm Safa Al Hagib Adam. I'm happy to share with you my view and remarks in this Sudan event about caught in the crossfire Sudanese women struggling for peace. In December 2019, Sudan witnessed non-violent revolution led by women and youth through the 30 years one-party regime of al-Bashir, ended by transitional government between the civilians and military, and partial peace deal with some armed movement in Juba, known as Juba Peace Agreement in October 2020. The transitional period interrupted by military coup in 25th of October 2021, and since then, no political stabilities. The current situation in Sudan since 15th of April is ongoing war fighting between the military and rapid support force in Khartoum, Sudan, and Darfur region. The fighting causes civilian displacement, refugees to the most of citizens in Khartoum and Darfur to neighboring countries, Chad, Egypt, South Sudan, Central Africa, and safer states in Sudan. People lose their livelihood and economic resources. The arbitrary bombing, fire shooting between the military and rapid support force in towns of Khartoum, Darfur, and Kordofan causes damages in basic services, health, water, electricity, and communication services. Rapid support force practices stealing properties, killing of people, and occupying their houses, and absence of government institution and absence of rule of law, especially in war areas. Also, departure of international organization and UN organization for safety and security reasons, for denial of access to pass for humanitarian support and victims and war affected. Women and girls are being affected by this conflict in forms of women being the constitute about 75% of the IDPs, and refugees represented the bigger parts in camps and accommodations center in schools or safe havens area. Women and girls targeted as weapons for war, being victims and subjected to horrific incidents of rape, sexual violence, including abduction, forced marriage by rapid support forces and tribal militias. This make lack protection and safety of moving, no access to adequate support centers or health services. Women and girls suffering from limitation of humanitarian in case of receiving major support by local civil society women groups, initiatives, and modest effort by very few international organizations state. So the need for women participation and struggle to be engaged in the peace process is known and is important, as women groups and youth resistance committee are instrumental in change that led to the non-violence revolution in December 2019, which demand civilian-led democratic government with 40% women participation. So it is more and most than ever before for Sudanese women to be part of any process dealing with current solution to stop war and discussing the humanitarian track or any further future political deal. Sudanese women struggle to get engaged in peace process is not new. During the Darfur peace talk, Abuja in 2005 and Doha in 2009, Sudanese women in Darfur were instrumental to make breakthrough to the agenda of women as recommendations. Darfur women priorities for peace and reconstruction. Challenges faces women during this struggle are lack of political will, lack of commitment of parties to work their talk, absence of clear mechanism for monitoring and evaluation to implement the peace accord and dividends, absence of accountability and impunity and rule of law, growing militarization phenomena, mobilization of tribes and community to militarize and involve in war, shrinking of women space for women movement and media and law activists to report and claim for their rights. The war is a military domain dominated by male warriors. Our recommendations, we called for action by the Sudanese people to immediately for military and support rapid force to stop this war, ensure and committed to safe passages to the humanitarian aid access to the affected civilian in Khartoum and Darfur. Immediate action for a mechanism to civilian protection and freeing civilian houses, hospitals, basic services, premises occupied by rapid support force. Before any effort for political deal, civilian parties to coordinate and unify their initiatives to stop war and to put pressure on rapid support force and military to sustain ceasefire, including strengthening the effort of humanitarian delivery. Ensure any process to be inclusive and leaving no one behind by including women and youth must be participating equally. A special recommendation for international community and UN in form of UN Women to support Sudanese women in connection with different women's initiatives to prepare a short emergency plan for UN Security Council Resolution 1325 National Action Plan to address the immediate needs of women in the humanitarian delivery to IDPs women, ensuring protection measures from rape and gender-based violence, and ensuring accountability, provision of trauma and social support centers, provision of legal aid, addressing issues of gender-based violence cases and monitoring and documentation. Also ensure the participation of women in all stages of humanitarian recovery and post-conflict. Finally, any process in Saudi Arabia or IGAD or led by Egypt or neighboring countries or USA and Saudi should not be disconnected from the women participation and people of Sudan to ensure the diversity management, which is the most important element to ensure way forward for rebuilding Sudan. Thank you, Safa Al-Agib.
I think it was really important to get that message from Safa. I had another email from her yesterday in which she focused on the situation of the refugees and said that it was especially grave that women were having to eat grass because the humanitarian aid was not coming in. And again, stress the fact that women need to be connected, not as victims, but to the stakeholders to be able to influence the outcomes. I think her comments about the need for UN intervention, the Security Council on the whole debate on this issue is also very timely, especially with the events that are coming up at the United Nations in the next several weeks. So we thank Safa for that. I'm going to turn now to Hala Al-Karib. I'm going to also mention that we are having some issues with connectivity with some of our other guests. So we may be going back and forth, but Hala, we're delighted that you could be with us. She is the regional director of the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa. And obviously that's a region that includes Sudan. SIHA is an organization established in 1995 by a coalition of women's rights activists with the aim of strengthening the capacity of women's organizations, addressing issues of subordination of and violence against women and girls. She is also the head of SIHA's journal, Women in Islam, which focuses on gender relations and women's rights within the communities in the region. So Hala, this is such a complex crisis with multiple challenges. Can you provide us with a brief overview of where you see things today, what you're hearing from across Sudan, and certainly what you're hearing in Darfur as well?
Thank you very much, Ambassador Melanie, and thank you for hosting me in this important platform. I guess I will, start from where Safa, has already, hinted and or started, and what you have earlier said, that only a few years back we were celebrating the participation of Sudanese women, in the protest, bringing down a 30 years dictatorship of Bashir and his Islamist allies. Since 2019 to date, Sudan has been going through a very difficult times. What's happening, to Sudan at the moment, and what Sudanese women are experiencing, it's not something that's happening in a vacuum. This violence is definitely based on decades of impunity, accommodating sexual violence and other forms of violence against women and girls, and violence against civilians, that the Sudanese state has harbored and encouraged for decades. And I just remembered that in 2021, immediately after the military coup against the, the transitional government in October 2021, and the women were also protesting the coup, and we have documented a number of incidents of sexual violence against women in central Khartoum at the time. And I remember, the testimonies or the documentation of some of the survivors who said that, what the soldiers, RSF and SAF soldiers at the time, who were representing, the same institution before the friction, because both of them, they coordinated the 221 military coup. They were telling the young women that you were getting what you deserve. You have to be raped. We're tired of you because you keep showing up on the streets, and the streets is not your place. So it's definitely, this war, it's against our agency, as women. It's against our agency as civilians who are aspiring, democracy, who are aspiring peace, and who are aspiring stability. But it's also, it happened because I think more should have been done. And I don't think, I think, whether the transitional government at the time, civilians movements, we have tried to, as a civil society, to amplify our voices and to speak about the fact that you cannot reward the perpetrators and allow them to be part of, a transition that aspire peace and stability. I think, the accommodations, of elements of SAF and particularly the RSF, has been highly problematic from the beginning. And the violations against civilians, has never stopped. it continued throughout the 20 years, since the war in Darfur started in 2003, and throughout the 27 months of transition, the extrajudicial killings, the rape in Darfur and Khartoum continued during the transitions, and all this has been happening, and also I do recall clearly the testimonies that we have collected in West Darfur. They have been a very severe violence that has taken place towards the end of West Darfur, the end of 2019 in West Darfur, and some of the survivors, the women survivors, they told us that the RSF, the Janjaweed, they told them clearly that, don't you think that if changes happen in Khartoum, that your life is going to be changed here? So the situation actually continued to aggravate and to become much worse, for people in Darfur during the transitions. But at the same time, the fact that, the perpetrators has not been held accountable, or, their violations has been addressed, and the eagerness of everyone, assuming that, the RSF could easily be accommodated, as women organizations, as, worked in Darfur for a very long time, who documented hundreds of testimonies of survivors of sexual violence, documented, the stories and the narratives of women who were raped in the sittings in Khartoum and during the protests. We understood very well that the core of such organizations like the RSF, it's an organization that was created to commit atrocities. It's one of the heaviest legacies of Bashir regime, and this is why he created them, to do the things, the really horrible things on his behalf, and on the behalf of of his allies, among the Islamists. So it's for us, I would say the writing was on the wall. We could really feel that it's very difficult, with such a heavy burden, that Sudan could have a successful transition, especially, when, organization of such nature, and also SAF Security Committee, they are actually controlling and dictating the overall structure. And please feel free to stop me at any point. Yeah.
Well, Hala, why don't I come back to you on what's happening today in Darfur? I'm going to turn now to Ambassador Monica Juma, who is the National Security Advisor to the President of Kenya. Monica is the first ever National Security Advisor in this capacity. And prior to her appointment, she served as Cabinet Secretary in 5 strategic ministries of the Republic of Kenya, and as ambassador in many capacities. I think it's important to note that the President of Kenya has been engaged in trying to broker a ceasefire with some of the other leaders in IGAT, part of the regional group that was mentioned earlier. She is also a member of the high-level Global Women's Network that we have, and we're pleased to have Monica with us. I know she's in and out of meetings, and so I'm going to turn to her now. Monica, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that you can tell us a little bit about the stakes, the regional situation, and the important role of civil society in this crisis. So we were together in June. The situation was grave then. There were attempts to get a ceasefire at the time, but I hope that you can tell us where things are today. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Melanie, and I want to greet everybody. Apologies for coming in late. We just concluded the Africa Climate Summit, and we followed it quickly with a quartet meeting on the Sudan, because President Ruto is chairing the quartet, and we were taking stock of what the state of play is. And that is why I was unable to log in at the beginning of this meeting. But let me begin by expressing my delight, really, and commending you, Melanie, and Georgetown for convening this extremely important meeting. I recall when we met in June, and this matter came up in our discussion, we were talking about the necessity and imperative to try and activate a global coalition for women in Sudan. So I'm very pleased that this has come to pass, and I would hope that we can really create a momentum around this. For the reasons that have been spoken before me, we know that the situation is not getting any better. In fact, the fighting is ongoing as far as we know. We know that the spread of violence into various regions of Sudan, in fact, is beginning to manifest in a bigger threat and risk of the fragmentation of the Sudan. We know that the likelihood of a political settlement is still a mirage at this point, because the parties, although they are having some degree of the belligerence, we can detect a dwindling morale, probably collapse or challenges of the command and control. Both sides are looking for material and financial support, as we know, and we know they are also under considerable pressure. We know that they are not exhibiting any appetite whatsoever to turn the situation
Hopefully we'll get the connectivity back.
we know
I think we have a severance in the connection there. Hala, if you can bear with us, maybe you can come in now on the situation in Darfur. There are reports of increased targeted violence against non-Arab populations, high levels of sexual violence, reminiscent of the genocide I fear 20 years ago. I'm gonna bear with me. We'll go see if we can get Monica back on. If we can't, we will continue on the Darfur. Monica, we lost you completely.
Can Ambassador Monica maybe turn the camera off to improve the streaming? I think that would be better.
Can you
Let's
hear
see
me
if
now?
that works. Yes, very well. Thank you.
Okay, you can hear me now. So sorry
Excellent.
about that. We know that the effect, we know that the effect of this war on the civilians is grave. People are dying every day. We know people are getting wounded. We know people are crossing borders. and are flooding across the countries, the neighboring countries. Tellingly, these numbers are not gender disaggregated. And I think this is extremely important. But what we know, even though we don't know what the numbers look like from a gender perspective, we know that it is women who are the majority in the camps. And getting know about members want to be participating and so forth. And so the discussion on women and the experience in this situation remains in women-specific forums. I think this is something we have to pay attention to, and it is not acceptable because we are talking to ourselves largely, which is important, but I think we have to think about how do we use the concerns of women where it matters and where things are going to be changed. We need to think about how we're going to reaffirm the women initiatives that are organizing against many, many, many odds, whether we are talking about the cooperative movement at the lowest level, the networking points, the service provisions, and so forth. But we, most importantly, Melanie, we must insist and ensure that women engagement happens where the difference will be made. But finally, we must really think about how do we insulate women activities. I was just having some conversations this week and I was being told that women are being targeted for standing secured, but we have seen ceasefires violated repeatedly. There is nothing that is promising us that there is a ceasefire that will hold, even if one is negotiated tomorrow. And so I think even as we push for a cessation of hostilities, we must insist that whether hostilities are ceased or not, there must be responsibility to respect international humanitarian law. There must be protection of civilians. There must be protection particularly of women and children. And particularly girl child. We must insist that the provision of humanitarian access must begin to target the vulnerable groups, and we must begin to signal that this is not going to be the usual history of Sudan where impunity has been traded, has been traded for violation of people's rights, and particularly the vulnerable ones and women in particular. In this regard, Melanie, I think we need to think in terms of how do we elevate this discussion to the highest level. So far, we have not seen any decision, even in the UN Security Council, a substantive discussion on the Sudan. I think there must be sufficient pressure even at the AU level, for guidance to the A3 so that we can have some discussions on this matter. The scale of violation of women and girls in Sudan today is unacceptable. And we must find a way that this finds expression as a legitimate agenda of the United Nations Security Council. We have a basis to invoke 1325. And we have a history that we must base this on, and we must insist on a very early appointment of a commission of inquiry and monitoring so that we can begin to register these violations in order to hold people to account. I think it is not acceptable that we can allow this to just be another story that we have seen, whether it was in Darfur 2003 or whether it has been the history of the Sudan. So signaling is crucial, and I think we have an opportunity with this forum to do so. Finally, it is really to speak to the whole question around the real problem, or the start of this problem. The start of this problem is that the Sudanese aspiration for civilian governance was sabotaged, has been hijacked, and there is active obstruction against it. And in that conversation, we must be very careful that it does also not become an exclusionist conversation where women are not participating, where their issues become are taken to the back burner of the conversation. So ways of making sure all the consultations that are going on really privilege the dignity of human beings generally, but women and girls in particular, so that this becomes fundamental. But also as we move on towards negotiating who engages in the future and in the new Sudan, these conversations need to be infused with a gender perspective deliberately. So Melanie, I think these are the critical issues in my mind. Looking at the current urgent humanitarian situation, looking at the deliberate effort of both sides, of all belligerents and other belligerents that are not within the command and control structures that are using women as a war effort, but also looking at how we are going to emerge out of this and making sure that those conversations and women issues are not add-ons, but they are critical agendas, both in that conversation nationally, within the region, internationally, and most significantly to signal this at the highest level within the United Nations Security Council. I thank you.
Well, we thank you, Ambassador Juma, and despite the connectivity challenges, we heard you loud and clear. That's a very powerful call to action for all of us in all the ways, from women's engagement to the humanitarian priorities, to raising this issue at the highest levels of the UN, et cetera. So we will work with you and others to try to move this agenda forward. But thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to go back now.
Thank you, Melanie. I'm going to step out because we are going to be having a meeting with Chad shortly. But I hope that I can review the recording of this and that we can continue to engage. Thank you very much.
That
and
would
to
be
you,
terrific.
Women of Sudan, you are not alone, dear sisters. You are not alone.
Yes, and that's really a very important message to get across today. Hala, just really briefly, what is happening in Darfur? We see these terrible reports now that seem to take us back to the really bad situation of the past. Can you tell us about anything about the drastic increase in the violence since the start of the conflict in April?
I think this war is one of the most ugliest conflicts that has been happening, I would say, in the region. It's a war that significantly targeted the urban centers in Darfur and in, of course, the greater Khartoum. And the fact that it is, first of all, because it's a conflict that happened between a structure that was, kind of built in together. SAF and RSF, they were literally, kind of, one more or less institutions, and they were in control of the urban centers of Al Junaina, for example, in West Darfur, collaborating together in Niala and in Greater Khartoum. So the fight is actually taking place at the hearts of the cities. And the implications of this fight is a complete destruction of all forms of infrastructure that's actually holding Sudan as a country together. And this is basically what happens at the moment. Adding to that, the massive number of deaths of civilians who were caught in the crossfire, the targeted sexual violence against women and girls that is been happening systematically. The first case of sexual violence we have documented, it happened I think around midday at noon in April 15. And since that day until now, every day passes, we receive more cases. 60% of the cases of sexual violence we're receiving are gang rape. And that's very telling that it's an intentional act, it's orchestrated, it's encouraged, it's part of how this war has been carried. And the fact that the RSF are on the ground in majority of the urban center, being in Junaina or in Yala or in Khartoum, more than 90% of the cases, according to the survivors and their families, they pointing towards the RSF engagements in these cases. And it's for us understanding how the armed militia has been actually carrying or waging their wars in rural Darfur for over 20 years. It's following the same patterns, in terms of forcing communities to leave their homes, committing sexual violence and terrorizing people, acts of looting, destructions of infrastructure, and just dominating, territories and areas. And right now, the level of disparity is extremely high at this point in time. But at the same time, the reactions from the international community when it comes to relief, when it comes to humanitarian aid, is very modest, and it doesn't match the size of the catastrophe and what's happening in Sudan.
Okay. Hala,
Yeah.
we'll come back and continue this. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Isa, who's got to be back in the surgery room momentarily, and maybe we can hear from him very briefly. He's the co-founder and Secretary General of the Sudanese American Physicians Association. While he is based in Pittsburgh, SAPA has doctors currently providing aid in Khartoum and elsewhere. Dr. Isa, thank you for joining us today. And perhaps, I know you've got to get back to your practice, but perhaps you can tell us briefly what the doctors are seeing as they struggle to bring medical care to those in need.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thanks everyone for having me today, and thank you for all the efforts and the advocacy and the great work that you are doing. Unfortunately, our staff in Sudan continue to see a disastrous impact of the collapsing healthcare system that was already fragile to start with even before the conflict. A fragile healthcare system that has gone through a lot through the 30 years of dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir, with a special impact what we're seeing right now in vulnerable groups, mostly women and girls and children as well. They are seeing lack of basic healthcare services, such as, for example, proper management of chronic healthcare conditions, lack of access to emergency services, and lack of access to life-saving medications and supplies. The other states that are nearby Khartoum have seen a great influx of the internally displaced, which exerting even more pressure on the healthcare facilities in these states that are not really equipped to deal with such a crisis and to deal with such a pressure. The challenge that our team and the other organizations or medical personnel are seeing at the moment are really the shortage of supplies, the security risks to the frontline providers in the conflict zone, the logistical challenge in terms of transporting supplies, personnel, the overwhelming number of patients presenting to a limited healthcare facilities, both in the conflict zone as well as in the states with the high IDPs influx, lack of proper data and information. That's one part that we're struggling the most with. We don't have enough data on exactly what's going on in terms of number of injured, number of death, and whatnot. In addition to all of that is the emotional and the psychological stress from everything that's happening.
We have heard that Doctors Without Borders, for example, has been saying that some of their physicians have been targeted for violence and they may have to pull out of some areas. Are your doctors reporting attacks on medical personnel as well?
Unfortunately, the attacks continue to happen sporadically in particularly in Khartoum State, West Darfur, and in North Kordofan area, basically the hot areas. The attacks are both at the hospitals and also the medical personnel when they move from one area to another, whether to provide certain services to patients that they cannot make it, or whether to transport medications and supplies. So yes, unfortunately, we continue to see those attacks.
If you had just one recommendation to make to the international community today for support in this area, what would it be?
I think, Ambassador, I would point two important recommendation, in addition, of course, of the immediate call for this conflict to stop, is to increase the humanitarian aid to the medical facilities in the conflict zone, with a special attention to the gender-sensitive aid, such as sanitary products and reproductive health items for women and girls, ensuring the availability of rape kits, for example, for the victims of sexual violence that are happening regularly there. Number two would be to call for a proper documentation of human rights violation and sexual violence that can be used in a court of law at some point, and accountability and pushing for international mechanisms to hold those violators accountable.
Thank you so much. I know you have to get back into surgery, but we're glad that you could be with us and tell us of the grave situation that is happening in terms of the delivery of healthcare. So thank you, Dr. Issa.
Thank you, Ambassador, for having me, and thanks, everyone.
I'm going to go now to Ajaratu Fatu Nda, and thank you so much, Ajaratu, for bearing with us as we are conducting this conversation. You have been the UN Women Country Representative in Sudan since 2018, a lawyer, a gender expert by training, a well-known gender activist throughout Africa, who's participated in key advocacies in your own home country of Senegal. And I know those efforts on your part and others have brought wonderful changes to the women's status there. We've been talking about the role that women have been playing on the front line of the pro-democracy protests over many, many years, how steadfast they've been in their efforts to have a civilian democracy established in Sudan. Since this most recent conflict started up in April, they've been playing a pivotal role in the humanitarian response. Can you tell us something about that? I know you've been deeply engaged in the Peace for Sudan platform, the work being done by the 49 women-led peace, humanitarian, and civil society initiatives, because already I think each of our speakers has talked about the humanitarian crisis.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador Melanie, for having me. I apologize for connecting late. You know, I thought that because I was in Dakar, things will be more smooth. But unfortunately, yesterday we have a storm that has affected the power system here.
I think all the
in fact,
connectivity issues have just been reminiscent of what we're discussing.
Exactly.
This crisis.
Exactly. So the women of Sudan, I think, as many women maybe around the world, know that they have to take their destiny into their hands. I will just talk a bit about the history, because, you know, I was one now of the few maybe head of agency or corporation that witnessed what the uprising in Sudan that is called by the revolution by the Sudanese. And at that time, we already worked very closely to strengthen the women's movement, because people tend also to forget that the women of Sudan were excluded from some external processes for about 30 years. So it was very critical also to reposition the women's movement, helping with better structure and, you know, support their participation to the drafting of the constitutional declaration that the first time came up with the 40% representation. So I want to highlight this 40% representation because throughout all the processes, Juba peace negotiation, the transitional period, etc., at least there's something that has been agreed. It's the 40% representation. It has never been materialized, but we used to say that since then, no one has come and say, okay, this 40% representation should be questioned. I think this is already a very important achievement for the women of Sudan. And it was on that momentum that the women of Sudan quickly turned up and established the Peace for Sudan platform, gathering women from different Sudanese states and coming up with a very strong statement, sent first to the UN Secretary.
Jaratu, if you can hear me, you have frozen on the screen. I wonder if you take off your video, whether we can get the connectivity back. Well, I think we have lost her, at least momentarily. Hala, I'm going to come back to you with the final questions before we turn to the audience, which is your recommendations on what the international community can be doing most constructively now to support the people of Sudan. Are there particular interventions that you would recommend to make a difference?
Absolutely. As I was saying earlier, that the size of the of the catastrophe doesn't match the amount of humanitarian aid and support that has been currently processed to Sudan. Dr. Mohamed Issa, he spoke about how critical it is to emphasize support for women and girls in Sudan at this point in time, in terms of access to reproductive health services, to humanitarian aid, to sanitary pads, to all these issues. And right now, it's an extremely slow process. The other thing is to exert enormous pressure on the current status quo administrations to facilitate and moderate the flow of aid. we know that, the current administration is not very collaborative when it comes to, processing aid and supporting access of humanitarian aid. So I think it's really critical to start exerting serious pressure and on securing, the aid convoys. Those are really very, very important. The other thing is that the condition situation of women at the borders and women refugees, it's extremely dire and very miserable. And most of the women, and girls that we are talking to, being in Chad or in the borders with Egypt or in the borders, with Ethiopia, they speaks about extremely dire situation and lack of access to services. So that's also very important. The current, status quo administration doesn't have clear plan in terms of how to handle IDPs from conflict areas. So they are still being housed inside schools or, in other public facilities in different parts of the country. And of course, that's the usual tension between the host community and the IDPs. And so there is definitely a need to have a relatively medium-term plan in terms of, how we can actually accommodate the IDPs from different parts of the country and engage them until this war comes to an end. Very critical point that was mentioned by Ambassador Monica. The complete absence when it comes to women and their narrative and what does peace mean to them, in any form of political process, that it did not happen. It never happened. It didn't happen in Jeddah. Actually, Jeddah for us as activists and as women who are working with communities on the ground was as a disaster, because the ceasing of hostilities that has been happening frequently, this is the time where sexual violence cases has been significantly increasing. And we really try to communicate that as much as possible. Unfortunately, our concern in terms of the violation against civilians, and particularly against women, as the result of ceasing of hostilities while, soldiers are occupying, the civilians' homes, it's actually a sign of further violations. So it's really important to involve women in any political process, our narrative, our agenda. What does peace mean to us? What does accountability mean to us? And those are really critical and important issues. I don't think it never happened in the history of Sudan where we had a meaningful engagements and participations of women in any of the processes. Women have been there, as an accessories to the process most of the time, but our voices were not really heard, and we were not actually being. Our agenda has not been part of the discussion or part of the conversations. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think that statement that you just made really dominates this whole conversation about the critical role women have played, the commitment they have displayed over so long, and yet time and again being left out of those critical processes that Ambassador Juma also noted really has to be reversed and addressed today. Let me ask you also, as you're talking about interventions from the international community, there have been, with the reports of the growing atrocities in Darfur, there have also been pleas for the international community not to be silent at this time. I understand that the ICC has opened an investigation. Do you have a view on that?
Sorry, my computer. I mean, it has been, I personally has been involved in the issue of Darfur for the past 20 years. I was there early on, when rural, it's quite painful to witness rural Darfur completely destroyed. Every, clinic, girls' schools, how all the potentials of women in rural Darfur who used to be farmers, productive traders, productive women, they have been transferred into displaced, and they have been, pushed to live and forced to live at the peripheries of urban centers. And we definitely believe that, the justice, it's needed. Justice is needed for stability. Justice is a foundation, for peace, and different level of justice, and accountability is critical. I think it's really important to empower the court to play its role, but it's also extremely frustrating to wave, the court as a threatening, kind of gesture, and then to bury, the procedures of the court, because that's really has extremely devastating impact in the communities and on women who has been waiting for justice for very, very long time. We never supported Sudanese throughout, the past years to or encourage, a process of justice that will respond to our aspiration. And this is why, we remain trapped in these cycles of conflict, because it's an accumulation of grievances, and the perpetrators, they feel completely comfortable, committing atrocities.
Yeah. If you don't mind, Hala, you're here with us standing alone at this point because we've had to have many of our other participants drop, usually because of the technical issues. But maybe we can take a couple of questions and just see what you might have to say about them. Mike, are you there?
I'm here. And I was just texting with Aji. Unfortunately, her connection has fully dropped off. She tried to rejoin and it's just not working. So Hala's the last one standing. But yeah, we have a few really good questions. So the first question is around what can the international donor community do to ensure the protection of women and girls and the humanitarian workers? And relatedly, how can we prioritize documentation of atrocities against women and girls in the wake of the ongoing conflict? Is that a commission of inquiry or independent monitoring mechanism? What's the best way forward?
I think definitely a commission of inquiry is going to be something that we would support in terms of really strengthening acts of documentations of the violation that are committed against women and girls. And I think it's also very, very important to hold Sudan accountable about how they have been treated women. I mean, subsequent Sudanese regimes and governments, including the transitional governments, how they have been treating Sudanese women. Sudan is one of the very few countries who didn't demonstrate any commitments, towards women human rights. Sudan did not ratify or showed any commitment to any of the protocols or international regional mechanisms. So, and the fact that, the sanction regime against Sudan does not have any elements that looks at the the gender issues, the gender-based violence issues that the Sudanese government has been committing throughout, the over 33 and 34 years. It's also highly problematic because our governments, they don't feel that the international community is actually pressuring them. And as the ambassador said earlier, that the cycle is that women's rights are always sacrificed, for the sake of reaching a political deal that satisfy, the men with guns. But we see very clearly that this does not work anymore. And it's beyond time. It's about time, to take the issues of accountability and women access to justice more seriously. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Holly. Thank you for getting us to this point. And as you just said, it's time to ensure finally that women's full participation and engagement takes place where the differences are being made, and it's not further sidelined as it has been all too often. I think that point has been underscored by everyone participating today. I think the issue about respect for humanitarian law, especially in the treatment of civilians, the women and the children, the need to make sure that corridors for humanitarian aid are open, but also that the aid is coming through and the support that's needed is there, that this issue finally get elevated by the Security Council at the United Nations, where it needs to be debated and pursued. And even the call, as you just made, for a commission of inquiry. I think a really strong call to action on many, many fronts. We hope that our audience has benefited from this, as I'm sure they have, and that those who are in positions to make a difference will move in a very significant way to act on many of these points. So we thank you so much, Hala. We also thank Ambassador Juma for joining us, for Safa Adam, for Ajaratu, who had much to say, but we couldn't connect with her because the storm in Uganda, in Senegal last night knocked out a lot of their connectivity. And of course to Dr. Isa. So thanks to all of you. This is an issue that is going to require consistent efforts on the part of everybody who is in a position to act. And we hope that that will happen, that this won't be just talking the talk, but that we will truly walk the walk. Thank you so much.